is a block of wood. Now, my year 7 students know that I can set fire to that block of wood, and I can warm my hands by standing close to that block of wood. Now, my year 7s know the reason why that happens is because the block of wood gives off energy by heating the surrounding. So when I set fire to this block of wood, it starts to heat everything around it. I am one of the things that is around it, so it transfers energy to me. My 7s also know that that energy has to come from somewhere. So where does that energy come from? If I'm going to get warm, I'm getting energy. Where's the energy from? Well, in this case, the energy is stored up in this block of wood. So this block of wood is storing energy. I set fire to it. It sends that energy off to me and to the air that is all around it. How much energy is this block of wood storing? Well, let's say this block of wood is storing 100 joules of energy. 100 joules of energy. Well, I said to you before that the energy has to come from somewhere. So where does the energy that's in this block of wood come from? It's a good question. We can answer it by looking at where the block of wood comes from. The block of wood comes from a tree. Now, we all know what a tree looks like. It looks like that. There's a tree. Now, my block of wood comes from the tree. Let's say this is my block of wood. And my block of wood was storing 100 joules of energy. All right, so let's say that this tree is storing 1,000 joules of energy. All right, so we've just pushed our question back one step further. We started with the energy that gets to me and warms me up. The energy has come from the block of wood. The block of wood has come from the tree, and the tree is storing loads more energy. So the block was only storing 100. The tree is storing 1,000. Where does the tree get that energy from? Well, you see, the thing is, the tree didn't start as this big, massive thing in the garden. The tree started as a small little plant, like this, on the ground, with leaves. This tree couldn't have started as a flower like this, but let's imagine that the tree started as a flower like that, a little plant. Now, over time, that little plant gets massive, and it turns into a tree. Fantastic. How does it do that? It does that because it gets energy from the sun, that big glowing ball of hot stuff in the sky. That sends energy down. The plant absorbs that energy, and it picks up some other stuff from the air around it, some particles from the air around it, some water from underneath it, all of that. And as time goes on, it gets bigger, store more and more of that energy. Now, what that means is that we now know where the energy has come from and where it ends up. The energy starts off with the sun, it moves into the plant, and then the plant gets bigger and bigger and becomes a nice big tree, like so. Why am I telling you all this? Well, it's about what happens to the tree when it dies. Because you see, that tree is storing up all of that energy really nicely. But one day, the tree will die, and the tree will fall to the ground, and it'll just sit on the ground like that. What happens to it? Well, the first thing is, we need to remember, the tree is still storing that energy. So let's say it's still storing that 1,000 joules of energy. Now, under some circumstances, that tree will get munched up by microbes and bugs that are sitting in the soil. And they'll munch up that tree, and they'll take that energy for themselves. Bugs need energy too. But sometimes, under very special circumstances, that might not happen. And instead, over time, bits of leaves and bits of dirt might fall on the tree. They'll get blown onto it by the wind. They might drop onto it from other trees that are around in the area. Bits of dirt, bits of stone, bits of old leaf, a dead animal here or there. They might land and fall on top of the tree. Now, if all of that builds up over time, you can have more and more and more and more and more and more and more. Building up, building up, building up, building up, building up. Soil and dirt and mud and stones and bits of tree and bits of wood and all sorts of things building up on top of this tree, which is still storing 1,000 joules of energy. It builds up and it builds up and it builds up. And I want you to imagine that you're that tree and you're underneath all of that dirt and that mud and that rubble and those stones and bits of wood and all of those things. Well, all of that kind of, it pushes down on you, doesn't it? It's kind of heavy. You're not going to be able to lie there and be really comfortable. It's going to be pushing down on you and pushing down on you and pushing down and pushing down and pushing down. Now, the scientific word we use for that is it gets compressed. It gets compressed. It gets pushed and squeezed and pushed and squeezed. And again, more dirt and more rubble is building up. And over time, more and more of it, so much of it, that this weight is enormous. And it gets squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And over many, 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 many years, we're talking millions of years, that tree stops looking like a tree. Because the tree gets squashed and squashed and squashed and squashed and squashed and starts to look like something else completely. It starts to look like this kind of dark, black, sooty stone. Looks a bit like a stone. But if you picked it up, your hands would get all black and dirty. We call that coal. C-O-A-L, coal. Why am I telling you all this? Who cares? Because that coal here is still storing that 1,000 joules of energy. So the 1,000 joules of energy that came from the sun went into the plant grew bigger, turned into a tree died, fell on the ground, buried by stuff, pushed and squeezed and pushed and squeezed and compressed underground, turns into this thing called coal. And for many millions of years, the coal sits there completely undisturbed. Until a couple hundred years ago, humans found out about it. And they dug these big tunnels into the ground. And they walked down the tunnels. And they pulled that coal out of the tunnel. They took those coals and they put them on trains. And they burned up that coal. And they use the energy to make the trains move. And they use the energy to power factories. And they use the energy to make electricity. And that energy powered what we now call the Industrial Revolution. That is where coal comes from. Many of you are thinking to yourself, what is this guy doing? Why is he talking about coal? The reason why I'm talking about coal is because this is one of my standard explanations that I give to my students. We talk a lot about dual coding, and what I'm going to do in this session is I'm going to do dual coding for teachers who can't draw. Because as you probably noticed during that, my drawing is not particularly good. Who am I? I'm Adam Boxer. You can grab me on Twitter at AdamBoxer1, or you can read my blog at chemicalorthodoxy.wordpress.com. During this session, I'm going to be hopping backwards and forwards between the mini whiteboard and the slides. Actually, I'm not sure I'm going to get back to the mini whiteboard. It depends how much time we've got. If you have any questions, that's absolutely great. But please, if you just pop them in the question and answer bar, then what we'll do is at the end, we'll have those questions asked. And I'm just trying to figure out how to make my screen bigger and how to change my camera. Here we go. Here we go. Right. There we go. You should now be able to see me. All right. Now, before we even talk about dual coding or anything like that, I just want to talk about that explanation and everything that comes apart from the images that I used. The bulk of this talk will be about the images and the way I used those, but I want to talk about the other aspects of that explanation, because what I'm hoping is that it was a good explanation. I'm hoping it was clear. I'm hoping that you understood what was going on. So what we'll do is first we'll look at sort of general principles of that explanation, then we'll drill down a bit and we'll look at the use of the images. Let's move on. Can I do that? Right. So what principles, what things did we notice in that explanation that I tried to do? So first off, it had a narrative structure. I'm not going to get too far into what a narrative structure is and stories and things like that, but I hope that you realize that things kind of built up on each other pretty clearly, pretty straightforward. There were no curveballs, and every piece of the puzzle kind of flowed together straight one onto the next. Now, the science teachers among you will often be, during the explanation, will be going, oh, he's missed this out, he's missed that out. Okay, yeah, a lot of the time that was deliberate. So I spoke briefly about water, but I did not mention carbon dioxide. So the plant, when it's really small, it grows by using light from the sun in photosynthesis, which is another word I didn't use. And it takes carbon dioxide from the air that's around it, water from its roots. I didn't get into that because it is important, it's super important, but this is for my year 7s. It's the first physics unit that they study before they've studied any biology. So they don't actually know anything about photosynthesis yet. If I start adding in additional complications, I run a risk of either stressing them out because they don't know what I'm talking about, and then them turning off, or worse, what we'll look at later, is they could start thinking about those things that I've mentioned and not what I'm talking about. Moved from something which is really concrete, so almost everyone will be familiar with a fire burning, to something which is super abstract, which is the process of a tree fossilizing and turning into things like coal. I also moved from something which they know about. So concrete things aren't always things that you know about. There are lots of concrete things that students won't know about. So for example, like the mechanics of how to build a bridge, I would argue, are relatively concrete, but a lot of people won't know about them per se. Whereas in this example, the thing that I chose is also something they know about, because we've studied energy transfers, and one of the examples that I've used many, many times is that block of wood burning. So even though it might not be something which is known about in a curricular sense for you guys, for them, it's a diagram that they recognize, and it's a diagram they've seen before. So what I'm doing is I'm hooking new knowledge onto old stuff. Right, actually, I tell you what. Okay, so I now want to move on to this guy, Richard Meier, because Richard Meier is, he's a cognitive scientist, and essentially he is one of the most important voices in talking about the use of images and words at the same time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back to my mini whiteboard, and I'm going to try and explain to you some of the stuff that he talks about. So let's see if I can go back, and then I can stop the share. There we go. Right, you should be able to see that now. So some of the stuff that I'm about to show you will be familiar to some of you. To others, it might not. At the moment, I am talking to all of you through your computer. What that means is that if this is your head, I hope you're smiling and enjoying yourself, information is coming to you from your computer. Now, information is not always going to be coming to you from your computer. It could be coming to you from someone in person. It could be coming to you from a book. It could be coming to you from just something that you're looking at or hearing on the radio, whatever it is. So what we'll do is we'll just call that, the thing that is outside you, the environment. So that's just stuff that is outside you. And it goes into you, and the aim is for it to go into this bit of your mind called the long-term memory. Like, that's where I want it to go eventually. Now, this isn't a physical thing that sits in your brain. It's an idea. It's a model. That part of the way that your brain works is that there is a bit called the long-term memory. But in order for it to get into the long-term memory, it needs first to go through this thing, which is called the working memory. And again, many of you will be familiar with this. That's absolutely fine. The working memory is the bit of your brain that kind of does the thinking, it does the processing. Whenever information comes in, first it goes into the working memory. And from there, it goes down, hopefully, into the long-term memory. One day, you might remember the things that I'm telling you. And that's represented by this arrow going back. Stuff coming from the long-term memory back up into the working memory. And if you express that in some way, you talk to somebody else, you'll just be giving information back to the environment. This arrow is often called remembering or retrieval. This arrow is often called learning, and to simplify a bit, it's also often called encoding. And I am simplifying, but it's going to be a useful word for us later, called encoding. Now, just as an aside, again, I'm simplifying. This arrow here, right there, in this very simple diagram, is the goal of all teaching. So the goal of all teaching is to help your students get something into their long-term memory. And that might be a simple fact, like what coal is. It might be a process, like how coal forms. It might be an experience, so what hot feels like is an experience that a person has in their long-term memory. So this arrow here is the goal of teaching. This arrow here is the goal of education, because we want our students to be able then to bring that stuff back. So everyone always is pontificating about the goal of education and stuff like that. It's this arrow here. Because what you want is your students to be able to take the stuff that you've taught them and apply it creatively in a novel situation. There's not much point in them just having it in their long-term memory. It's about the stuff that's in their long-term memory informing their human experience. Now, there's a problem with this diagram. You see the long-term memory here? I've drawn it really big. And I've drawn it really big to tell you that it's really big. And I've drawn it even going off the bottom of the mini whiteboard. I've not drawn a bottom to it. And the reason why I did that is because the long-term memory at the moment, we're not really sure what its limit is. We don't know where it ends. We haven't really found anyone who's got so much stuff in their long-term memory already that if they learn something new, it pushes out something old. So, for example, when my year 10s tell me, oh, sir, I can't do chemistry because if I learn chemistry, then I'll forget all my biology, they're just having me on. That's just not the way that the memory works at all. And we have not found a limit to the long-term memory. There has to be a limit because it's a physical structure. It's stuck in your brain. It doesn't go on forever. But we haven't yet found it. We don't know where it is. The working memory, on the other hand, is severely, severely limited. It's teeny. Now, I'm not going to get into how many things can fit into your working memory. 4, 5, 6, 7. It's very, very small. Not a lot of stuff can fit into your working memory, which means that the working memory sort of acts a bit like a bottleneck for learning. Let's have our environment arrow coming into it now. So let's say these are all the things that I want students to know, all this stuff that I want them to learn. The working memory sort of sits here, but it kind of acts as a bit of a bottleneck, that it's only got a small channel for that stuff to fit through. And now if I'm trying to fit loads of stuff through it, through that channel, then like obviously there's not enough room there. This is known often as something called cognitive load theory, which is where you try and stuff too much things, too many things, too much information through your students' working memory. Just got a little channel over there. Why did I do all this? I did all this because it relates to an empirical finding from Meier. We'll go back to him now. There we go. Right, so here's Richard Meier. Like I said, he's a cognitive scientist. He's also a top bloke. I emailed him a few months ago, actually, asking him a couple of questions, and he got right back to me. And the reason why I emailed him is because the stuff that we're going to do today is kind of complicated because it comes from a very kind of interwoven tradition. So there's a lot of different interpretations of the things that we're going to talk about today. So I wanted to email Richard Meier to make sure that I had it 100% correct. He got back to me straight away. He's a really good guy, and his writings are quite accessible, and I'll give you a reference towards the end of this. He did experiments testing the use of images and words in teaching new things. So he took an explanation that looked a bit like, let's see if I can get it, there we go. So I'd like you to read that for me, please. Okay, so there's a written explanation of how a bike pump works. Here is a diagrammatic explanation of how a bike pump works. And I'll let you just kind of let your eyes just wander over that for a bit. Okay, now hopefully you can see my mouse. I don't really know. So hopefully you can see my mouse as I kind of move around the screen here. So this is your bike pump. This is the air. So the air goes towards the bike pump. This is the piston. You pull the piston up. You can see there's a little valve over here that opens. This valve over here starts to close. The air kind of sucks into the bike pump as the piston pulls up. This valve is closed. The air is now inside the bike pump, etc., etc. You then push the piston down and it squeezes out. Great. And what Meier wanted to know is if he gave participants just the words, how well did they understand it? If he gave them just the pictures, how well did they understand it? If he gave them the words and the pictures together, how well did they understand it? And the way he tested whether they understood it is through what are called like application questions. So he said things like, you know, if a bike pump was broken, it clearly wasn't working, which bit would you check first? Stuff like that. Or how would you go about checking it? What he found, surprise, surprise, is that the images and the words together worked better than just images or just words. So to say that again, that the images and the words together worked better than just one or the other. He called that the multimedia effect. This is the important bit. He called that the multimedia effect, which is an empirical finding. It's something that we know from laboratory studies and from experiments with real people, that pictures and words work better together. That's called the multimedia effect. How does this relate to dual coding? I will show you now. Let's see if I can stop the share. Right, let's get back to this. Now, the way I showed it to you before is that I just looked at the working memory like that, and I just had one channel going down. Scientists hypothesize, and the first scientist to do this was a guy called Alan Pavio. And again, the reason why I said to you before that this is complicated is because Alan Pavio was looking at something slightly different, and the way that the tradition then got interpreted and his findings were studied was different by different people. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be following the cognitive tradition, which is essentially what Richard Meier did when he was looking at the dual coding hypothesis, which is what Pavio came up with. Sorry, that was a lot of stuff. Let me go back a bit. Pavio was looking at the way that the brain interpreted pictures and the way that the brain interpreted language. And essentially he said that the way that the brain interprets pictures and stores pictures is different to the way that it interprets and stores language. That is called dual coding theory. The way that that is interpreted by both Pavio and later, and certainly within the cognitive tradition, what's important for us is that there are two channels in the working memory. So I drew just one box. In reality, there are probably two boxes. There may well be more, but let's just focus on two for the minute. One of these boxes is called the visual box, or loop, or channel. It's also sometimes called the visuospatial channel. This one is called the verbal channel, or it's sometimes called the phonological loop. Visual deals with pictures and images. Verbal deals with language. But the language that verbal deals with is speaking, is listening, but is also reading. So if you were to read that word verbal, that's being processed in the verbal channel. So even though you're looking at it and seeing it, this is where it's being processed in the verbal, because it's to do with language. Anything to do with language goes through here. Anything to do with things that you see that aren't language goes through here. So if you see words, it doesn't go through here, it goes through here. Within the cognitive tradition, there is therefore an argument or a hypothesis that both of these have a channel, like that. And I can get information through both of them at once. Can I get twice as much information through both of them? It's not quite that straightforward, if only it were. But the idea is that 2 is better than 1. If I can get information through both of them at the same time, it's better than getting information through just one of them, because you can see here I've got 2 arrows. Remember, I had all of these arrows at the top, right? Representing loads of information. Well, if I can get 2 arrows through at once, that's better. Now, do you remember before I said that the arrow going down was sometimes called encoding, right? So if this is one code or one bit of encoding, and this is another code or another bit of encoding, you have two of them, or dual codes or dual coding. That's where the dual coding bit comes from. So coding here is not to do with someone sitting at a laptop writing code in Python or VBA or whatever. Coding here is to do with getting information into the long-term memory through the working memory. And in this case, we are doing dual coding. We're doing it with both. Now, that is a theory which explains the empirical finding that doing it through both is better. It could be that there's some other mechanism by which it works that we don't know about. It could be that our brains are operated by magic fairies, and some of those magic fairies like pictures, and some of those magic fairies like words. And we would call that the magic fairy theory. But we don't think that that's the case. We think that the theory is that there's one channel in your working memory called the verbal, and one channel called the visual, and you can operate both of them at the same time. Now, what that means, by the way, and this is something that I get a bit pedantic over, is that dual coding is a process that happens in the head of the person who's listening, normally a student. So teachers don't do dual coding. Students do dual coding. The brain does dual coding as it processes information. So it's not the case that the teacher is doing dual coding. If I get one up right now, what I'm doing, I'm not doing dual coding. Using this picture, I'm not doing dual coding. I'm doing teaching. You're doing dual coding. If you're interpreting this image and these verbal pieces of information at the same time, you're the one doing dual coding, not me. Let's hop back then to our slides. Here we are. Okay. So I've got some, I think I wrote some definitions. Okay, we'll get some definition in a second. So those were our 4 principles that we had so far. And there is the final part there, point 5, which is that images and words are better than words or images alone. There's your theory, dual coding theory. And the theory is processing is storage, representation, recall, and that's where things get complicated when you talk about representation, and there are all sorts of funny words like imagens and logogens, which we're not going to get into. And there's your multimedia effect. So this bit for me is the key. Dual coding theory is a theory that explains the multimedia effect. It's almost like you have an effect, which is the apples fall out of trees, and gravitational theory is a theory that explains that. Okay, let's see if you can see me now. Okay, because I think I'm done with the whiteboard. All right, what's coming next? So can teachers do dual coding? I don't know, like I said, I mean, obviously it's not the kind of thing that you should get really, really upset about, but for me personally, within this tradition and this understanding and application of dual coding theory, I think when most teachers say I'm doing some dual coding, what they mean is, well, actually the students' heads are doing dual coding. I'm just doing teaching. It's like, you know, if you come up with a new teaching technique and you wouldn't call it learning, because learning is something that the students do, not the teachers. You wouldn't say, what am I doing as teacher today? I'm learning. Or I've got this great explanation of coal that I'm going to learn to the students. It's just not how it works. Right. Really interesting stuff, and this is where like the game really changes, because I honestly, I don't think anybody who's listening to this now will think, oh, you know, I'm really shocked that diagrams and pictures are a good way to explain stuff. Where it really gets exciting is the further effects. And in Meier's research, what he did is he started looking around and trying to figure out what was the best way to utilize words and images together. So let's say you have those words, the bike pump, and you have those images of the way the bike pump works. What if I put them like this, or if I put them like this, or if I have this one on one page and this one on another page? Like, how does that make a difference to the learning outcomes? So first I want you to have a look at these 2 diagrams. Okay, so these 2 diagrams come from the Education Endowment Foundation's report into secondary science, which was published a couple of years ago, which is very, very good. And in it, it's got these 2 diagrams of the heart. And it asks a very simple question: which one is better? And I always ask this question whenever I show these diagrams, and it normally splits the room in terms of which one is better. So I'm going to give you 5 seconds now to think about which one you think is better and why. So about half the room says that B is better because it looks a bit less cluttered. So A kind of looks a bit cluttered, it looks a bit harder to follow, whereas B is a lot cleaner. You can kind of, I guess, see things much more clearly. But actually, in reality, A is the better diagram. A works better because of something called the split attention effect. And actually, I tell you what I'll do is I'll hop back onto my visualizer. Stop share. There we go. To try and explain what the split attention effect is. Well, this is sometimes called the spatial contiguity effect, but we'll just stick with split attention because that's a little bit easier. So let's say I'm looking at it from above. So this is me from above looking at the screen. Okay, so this is the screen, and then you've got two diagrams. You've got one which had the heart over there and the key over there. Now, actually, when I look at this diagram, I don't look at it in one straight line. I look at it like this and like this. But obviously my eyes don't do that. My eyes can't look at two places at once. So sometimes my eyes are here on the diagram, other times my eyes are on the key. Whereas if the heart and the diagram are one and the same, and they kind of sit on top of each other, like that, I'm not really moving my eyes, I'm not really moving my head, I'm not having to focus my attention in two separate places. Now, even though this doesn't look like much, and it looked like the heart and the key are quite close to each other, that act of moving from one to the other is actually enough to throw off your attention a little bit. And the example that I like to use is recipes. So recipes always have like the ingredients at the top and then the instructions underneath. And it really stresses me out because I always find that I'm looking up at the the ingredients at the top, and then I'm going down to the instructions, and I'm moving my head up and down and trying to figure out what to do. And I find that I like forget stuff really easily. And the recipe says, you know, in the lines it says, mix the flour with the sugar and the eggs. And I'm like, oh God, how much flour, how much sugar? And then I go, right, it's 180 grams of flour and 200 grams of sugar. And then I go, and then I'm trying to figure out, I can't remember, and then I'm going to weigh this out. I'm going up and down, and it just leads to my confusion about it. And I don't understand why the instruction doesn't just say, add 200 grams of flour to 180 grams of sugar. That will make my life a hell of a lot easier. Now, how much more so if any of you have ever tried to follow a recipe on your phone, on like BBC Good Foods, so they have one tab that's got the ingredients and the other tab that's got the instructions. And I find that as soon as I go from one to the other, I've forgotten what I was looking for. So it says, okay, I need to get, you know, mix the flour with the sugar. So fine, I've got to go back to the tab. What was I looking for? Was it the flour and the sugar? I was 200 of flour and 180 of the sugar. And then I go back and I'm like, was it 200 of flour and 180 of sugar? Or was it 180 of sugar and 200 of flour? And I can't remember. And that's partly this split attention effect, this act of going like this and moving from one place to the next. So this one is bad and this one is better. See those fancy animations there, right? That one's bad, this one's better. So our next principle then would be images and words should be integrated together. So don't have one image on one page and your words on the next page, or don't do a key if you can avoid it, that kind of thing. You should try and integrate them. It's also, by the way, they can't do this like universally, but in science exam papers, for example, you've got your double spread, and if there's questions to go on a graph, you've got your graph on one side of the spread and your questions on the other side, but they would never have the graph on this page and the questions on the next, because then the students would be having to flick backwards and forwards, and that would introduce like not a huge amount of load, but enough of a load to be unfair when it comes to answering the question. There's also the redundancy effect. What is the redundancy effect? So the redundancy effect occurs when information that includes redundant material results in less learning than the same information minus redundant material. A good example for this is when people do presentation and read out words which can be found on the screen. This can actually hinder learning because it's extra sensory information to process unnecessarily and actually results in your mind expending more cognitive effort in trying to ignore one of the sources of information. Oof, not fun, is it? Nobody likes being that person who sits through a talk where someone's got words on the board and they're just reading them out. Thanks, mate, I can read, right? You don't need to be talking it out. it's actually more stressful and it's harder to follow. So a lot of us know this, right, intuitively, or we've heard it, and yet often we do still make that mistake. We just did split attention, which the images and words should be integrated. That's that one. And then our next principle is no redundant material. Don't read out visible text. Most of us might kind of be familiar with that already. I want to push it one step further because it's, part of the reason why I'm doing this is because I like to take the research and plug it into a real classroom context and try and explain to you how there are things which are obvious that we shouldn't do and things that are obvious that we should do. But there are other things which are a bit less obvious, but also fall within this umbrella. So take, for example, so let's go, sorry, should we get back to this? Okay, actually, let's wait a second. No, just deciding how to do this. Okay, so a better diagram would be like this. I'll tell you why. Because if we go back to these two diagrams, we know that this one is better than this one. If I put this diagram on the board, I don't just put it up there for the kids to read. I'm also saying, and this one is the aorta. That's called the aorta. This one is the left atrium, and it's where the blood gets pumped down into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it goes out to the rest of the body. Okay, all of that stuff, what I'm doing is I'm talking about stuff that's already there. So essentially, that is kind of redundant, because those words don't need to be there. If those words weren't there, the students wouldn't lose anything, because I'm going to be explaining to them what's going on, which is why this diagram would be better, because I'll put that diagram up, and then I don't have labels that I'm going to be reading out while my students are looking at the labels and reading them themselves. There's no redundant information there. So that is even better, fancy animation. But there is one final trick. And to illustrate the trick, and I'm trying something that I've not tried before, so I'm hoping it works. Okay. So here I've got a maze. This is like a child's maze that can be found on the back of a like a cereal box. You can get them online, sometimes you get them in like menus in restaurants for the kids to do and stuff like that. And all the time that I'm talking about this maze, which is a nice big circle, it's got great background, it's got black lines, and what you need to do is you need to take that ball and get it from the edge where it is and get it into the middle, trying to get it as quickly as you can. How many of you are already trying to solve that maze? Probably quite a few of you. Stop trying to solve the maze and listen to me. I'm the presenter here. I didn't tell you to start trying to solve the maze, and yet you're trying to solve it. The reason for that is because, like, who wouldn't? It's there. It's in front of you. I'm going to start doing it. I know what it is. So actually, this does throw in a bit of a complication, because any information that's on the board, anything that's on the board, is a source of distraction for your students. Not necessarily like negative distraction in that it's like, oh, a bee's come into the room, lesson ended, but a sense of distraction in that they're doing something which isn't paying attention to me. Do you remember we said splitting attention is bad? I want them to be paying attention to me. I don't want them to be like splitting their attention and moving attention here, attention there, attention here, attention there. I want them to be listening to me. As soon as that picture goes up on the board, they're not listening to me anymore, or they're kind of listening to me with half an ear, but they're not really listening to what I'm saying. Now, if you go back to the Cole explanation, there's something else that applies as well. So this is a diagram that image that I found online. Kind of goes similar process to what I was talking about. Now, when I drew my tree on the ground and I put the layers on top of it, a lot of the diagrams that you see have things like dinosaurs in them like that, and at the varying different levels. You see them here. I didn't do that for a good reason. And I also, for example, didn't say, and by the way, this is how dinosaurs form as well. And you might have some dinosaurs buried in this mud because it's trees from so many millions of years ago. The dinosaurs are around there as well. There's a good reason I didn't do that. Now, some teachers would say, you should put that in because it's nice, it's relevant information, it's interesting, it helps fill like a coherent understanding of chronology and stuff like that. That's one argument, fine. But I guarantee if I had to put dinosaurs into that, at least one, and probably more of my students would have put their hand up at the end and asked a question about dinosaurs. Now, obviously, that's really nice because it shows they're eager to learn, they're interested, and all of that stuff, right? But how long have they been thinking about dinosaurs for? As soon as I put dinosaurs up on the board, what were they thinking about? They were thinking about dinosaurs. So some teachers would say, okay, well, the point of, if you're training teachers, for example, and a kid asks a question that's off topic, So the discussion becomes about, okay, so how much should you indulge that question? Should you say, oh yeah, let's go with that. You know, we'll answer questions about this for a little while. Or should you say, that's a really great question, I want you to answer it another time. But that's missing the point, because the real point is, how long was that kid thinking about dinosaurs for? If that kid was thinking about dinosaurs for the last 5 minutes, they weren't thinking about coal. So that there is a source of distraction. So in terms of sources of distraction or splitting attention, you have things like a bee coming into the room, you have things like students misbehaving, you have whole debates and flame wars online about whether or not you should have displays on the walls and stuff like that. Great, sure. All of that is like clear and obvious to us that there's a question to be asked. Things like, well, I've got stuff on the board. Are my students going to be looking at that, or are they going to be listening to me? Not so much. If I mention something in my explanation that is distracting to them, like a joke, if I told a joke, or like I had some banter with a kid while I was in the middle of an explanation, is that a good idea? It's a question, it's a legitimate question to be asked. As soon as you split that attention, they're not listening to you. Well, what's the point in you being there? So that diagram that I showed you, let's go back. So that diagram of the heart was even better. The thing is, as soon as I put that on the board, students are going to be looking at it, and their eyes are going to be roving all over it, and they're going to be trying to understand what is this thing? How does this relate to what's in my body? How does this relate to stuff that I know about the heart already? What I want them to be doing is listening to me, and as I describe the different parts of the heart, which is why the best is just a blank canvas. Start from a blank canvas, direct attention, decide which part of the heart you want to start with, and move things around. In my explanation at the beginning of Cole, I didn't start once with a completed image. That's because I wanted you to be following me. I didn't want you to be following your own gaze around. I wanted you to be listening and following me, listening to and following me. Our final principle there is that everything on the board is a potential site for distraction. See there, I just read it out even though you hadn't had a chance yet. Start blank, actively direct attention. So what I do is I'll start with a blank board, and I will literally say things like, look at this, look over here. If there's something that is not amenable to that or not appropriate, so let's say I did want to show the students this maze, I'm not going to draw that out, that's ridiculous. I would say I'd put it up there and I'd say, I'd like you to just look at it for a minute. I'd let them spend some time, and I'd say, right guys, I want all eyes up here, all eyes on me please. And I would look around, which is a Douglas technique called be seen looking. And I would use my radar, and I would really check which students were and which students weren't paying attention. And I would say, I'm still waiting for 1 student or 2 students, or well done, Daniel, you're paying attention now. I might use something called Pastel's perch, which is the position in the class that you choose to stand in that gives you the easiest way to see all of your students without having to move around too much. Again, all the Douglas, which I recommend you check out. But the idea is I'd let them spend some time having a look at it, and then when I'm ready to teach them and I'm ready to talk to them about the bits that I want them to look at, I'll bring them back to me. I'll make sure they're paying attention to me, and I'll say, look here, look here, look at this bit. I don't want you to look at that. Ignore that for the minute. Look at this bit over here. Thank you. I can see everyone's looking at this bit. Brilliant. Over here, this is, and move from there. A lot of people are writing like books, teach like this, teach like a pirate, teach like a champion, all of that stuff. If I were to write a book, it'll be called Teach Like an Attention Megalomaniac, right? If the kids aren't paying attention to the thing that you want them to pay attention to, they're not going to learn as well. It's that simple. I know what I need my students to be paying attention to right now. If they're not doing that, then they're not going to learn as much. So there we go. Everything on the board is a potential site for distraction. Right. Now, I saw this tweet up earlier today, and I added it to the slides this morning, and I think it's really important. I have finished what I wanted to say to you about multimedia effect, dual coding theory, split attention, and redundancy. And I think this tweet from Simon is an absolutely legitimate question to ask. I mean, most of you are going to be listening to this talk and going, I hope at least, and going, oh, that's interesting, really interesting, and thinking about all the ways you can apply it to your practice, and then doing absolutely nothing with it, because we're not in school. So much as you would like to, I can use this period 5 today, you can't do that. So I think there's a legitimate question to be asked about what you do now. And so I literally just like not half an hour ago, but about an hour ago, had a few quick thoughts about what you could do. So in terms of ways to implement, so first off, obviously, is to explain something to someone else at home. A piece of paper, get a pen, or you don't necessarily need that. Just talk to someone and explain something to them. Carefully sequence your explanation from concrete to abstract, from known to less known, all of that stuff. Brilliant. If you do have like a mini whiteboard and a pen, or you can just do it with pen and paper, to be honest, at home, that's absolutely fine. Can you do it with PowerPoint? Yeah, you can do it with PowerPoint. Again, as long as you use the animation. So don't let stuff come up before you're ready for it to come up. Do a video, upload it to Twitter. If it's a short video, you can upload to YouTube. It's dead simple. And if you want, you know, I would honestly, like, I would love to see if people are putting videos up, and I'd love to have a chat with them. So if you do want to do something like that, let me know, and I'll be more than happy to have a look and talk to you about it. You could draft a script, really. So I personally don't draft scripts because they stress me out. I know a lot of people do draft scripts when it comes to explaining stuff. Finally, I've got some cool things to read, and I'll get to questions and answers in a minute. What have we got? So first off, Richard Meier. So there's Cambridge Handbook of Cognition Education. I think this is 2018 or 19. It's really recent. If you do happen to have a copy, brilliant. If you don't, it's expensive. It's an academic book, but I would suggest always with academic texts that you can always email authors and ask for a copy. There was also a shorter version of this written up in Impact Journal, which is the Chartered College of Teaching. So if you do have access to the Chartered College of Teaching's Impact Journal stuff online, then you can look at Richard Meier's section there. And Kat Scutt from the Chartered College has collated a whole load of stuff on designing multimedia there, including a link to that Impact article. So I'd recommend you have a look there. Definitely 100% check out Pritesh Raitura's blogs. Reason for that is because he pushes this one step further, because he's looking not just at how you like explain a process in the way that I did, but also how you can use principles of multimedia to explain concepts better. So for example, using a Venn diagram is using visual and verbal, because you've got verbal, which is the words, and visual, which is about showing the relationship between them. A decision tree, visual, verbal, where you break apart words. So so going on with the coal stuff, what I would then do is I'd be talking about fossil fuels, and I'd write fossil fuels, and underneath fossil, I'd write remains of living things from millions of years ago. Fuel, we can burn it to get energy. And again, that's a way of visually breaking apart the words and showing what's going on in there. And Pritesh is super at this kind of stuff, so definitely check out his blog. Carl Hendrick and Paul Kirshner, they've got a brand new book out called How Learning Happens, and I definitely recommend that generally, as well as the chapter on dual coding and the multimedia effect. And then also free online is Oliver Caviglioli's course on Senecas. I think Ollie is speaking at researchEDHome in a couple of weeks, or next week, I'm not sure, but you can check that out on the timetable when he's talking about this stuff. And he's also pushing it further, and I think emphasizing slightly different strands of the tradition. And I definitely recommend that as well. Which is what I wanted to say to you, which means it is now time for questions and answers. And I'm not sure how that's going to happen. I think someone's going to give them to me.
Yes, Adam, can you hear me?
Great.
We've got a question here, very straightforward question. We haven't got very much time, but about 10 minutes, and some very interesting questions. But the first one is very straightforward. Do all these principles work for all learners?
Okay, so this is, so some of you who are listening might think, oh, this sounds a bit like visual learning or auditory learning and the old learning styles, and you thought that those were hokum. Good news, those are hokum. This is something that, to our knowledge, applies to everyone. Now, obviously, if you are visually impaired, then your image channel might not be as easy to emphasize as somebody else. If you have language processing problems, then your verbal channel might be harder, might not be as available to a teacher as as for anybody else. But broadly, the idea of vision and auditory learners is that some people are visual learners, and they're best at learning. The way they learn stuff best is through visuals. Other people are auditory learners, and the way they learn stuff best is through listening. That's not the case. We don't have like 2 or 3 different types of people who have different learning styles. This is for everyone. So broadly, on average, it will benefit absolutely everyone if you as a teacher take advantage of both their visual loop and their auditory loop. But don't confuse this with learning styles. Learning styles is about saying you've got this person who is like this, and this person who is like this, and this person who is like this. This is saying that all people are broadly and on average, all people will benefit from this. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Thank you very much. Another one, someone is trying to figure out what information goes in the exercise books. So they're saying, when you're doing this, do you get your students to copy some of the imagery and the diagrams, or do they answer questions that you pepper through your explanations and so on and so forth?
I guess that's a curricular question, and it's obviously going to depend from lesson to lesson, from subject to subject. Like in my, if I was doing science, and that was my lesson on coal, I want them to have a familiarity with the process of how coal forms, but without having to know all the steps off by heart. Later on, like at GCSE, when we talk about crude oil, I might want them to know a bit more about the process and to actually have that in their long-term memory. But at the moment, I'm sort of just making it the kind of that whole thing is to explain what's going on and to give them a sense of understanding. But I don't necessarily need them to know all of it off by heart. So what I might do afterwards is then just give a couple of bullet points and say, coal is formed from ancient plant matter that has been compressed underground over time. And that would be enough for the kids to put into their exercise book. Like, the different schools might do different things. You might have given them an explanation like that. You might give them a diagram like that. There are some diagrams that I use and will draw live on the board, but I will then also provide for them as a printed version. If there's no benefit to the students like copying something down, then there's not much point. I might as well just provide it for them. If there's a way that I can get them to process it. So when I do the heart, for example, that one that we just did, I do a simplified schematic diagram of the heart, and then I can choose. I can either ask them to copy it down or give them a copy, or I can, and then use that as a reference for later. So I can then ask questions where they have to go back to the diagram and use that to help them, or I can give them a diagram which has got bits chopped off out of it, and then they'll have to kind of remember and process and figure out what bit goes where. So there's no answer to that question, because it really depends on what you're doing right there and then with your class at that point in your curriculum.
Thank you. Someone else is talking about having seen some diagrams that are overly cluttered, and they're wondering if there's any guidance on how many words in a single diagram would be too much. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or might it be a good idea to use different coloured labels, perhaps?
Okay, so there's no hard and fast rule. I have seen a lot of images online that people post that, to me, look incredibly cluttered and very, very difficult to follow. What I want to emphasize throughout all of this is that the way I interpret, well, not the way I interpret, but the way I use dual coding theory in my class is about making something that is complicated simple. If your diagram doesn't do that, if it doesn't take something that's complicated and making it simple, it's not a good diagram. And it might be always a good idea to like touch base with someone and show it to a friend or even a student, get feedback from students and say, like, how does this look to you? Is this too complicated? Is this too much? And certainly with colors, I personally never use colors. This is my black Edding 361 pen. Edding, if you're watching, I would appreciate a crate of these sent to my house. Thank you. This is a great pen, but it's black. I think I've got a blue one somewhere, but I very rarely use it. If I were going to use another color, I'd only use one because it can get a bit too confusing for me personally. But I know some really brilliant maths teachers who will use colors to emphasize different parts of an equation, for example. So if you want to do if you're moving like terms to either side of an equation, you might want to do the like terms in a particular color so the students can see, that x and that x, the 2x over there and the 5x over there, those are like terms. That's helpful. But sometimes you see stuff that's in color and you just think, not for me. Remember, the goal here is not about looking pretty. This is dual coding for teachers who can't draw. None of the images that I drew to you today are going to be put up on the walls of the Tate. It's just not a thing. My manual dexterity is weak, and I never, my drawing is not of a high aesthetic quality, but it's still clear and it's still easy to follow. This isn't about looking good and putting a picture on Twitter and getting loads of likes. This is about taking something which is complicated and explaining it more simply.
Thank you. Someone is asking, is asking students to take notes off the board the same as split attention? If the teacher is still talking, presumably yes. And they're just wondering what your thoughts are.
Great question. Yeah, so something I realized on reflection in the early days of my teaching is that I'd put stuff on the board that I wanted the kids to have as a note, but I wouldn't specify when I wanted them to have it as a note, or I'd be drawing a diagram, you know, like this using the mini whiteboard, and I'd see students were starting to copy that. And that's bad because it means that they're focusing on trying to get the stuff into their book as opposed to what I'm saying, and I want them to be listening to what I'm saying. Like I said, teach like an attention megalomaniac. So what I do is I have my students put their pens down, put their hands down, all of that, so that I know that they're paying attention to me. A really good example is and I actually explain to students why I'm doing that. You know, don't just like, you don't want them to think that you're a fascist, even though you are an attention fascist. You want them to know why you're doing what you're doing. So, for example, once at the beginning of every one of my lessons, we start with a mini quiz, which goes in the back of their exercise book, and they mark it in purple pen. So at the end of the mini quiz, I'll say, I want you to get your purple pens out, and they know by now, so I draw them at the beginning of the year. They take their purple pen out, and they hold it up in their writing hand. So I see a sea of right hands and a couple of left hands, each with a purple pen. And the reason why I make them do it in their right hand, in their writing, their strong hand, is because it also means that they've stopped writing. Because what I saw when I first started doing is that a lot of kids would put their purple pen up and still be writing answers to the questions in their book like this. And I didn't want them to be doing that because I wanted to go over question one. I wanted them to be listening to me. So I have them hold their pen up, their purple pen, which means that they have, by definition, stopped working now. So I will make my students put down their pens. I've confiscated pens in the past for students who are writing when they're not supposed to. There's one student who could not kick the habit, and I ended up giving her a detention for it. And we had a very long conversation. She understood where I was coming from, and she stopped doing it afterwards. You know, fundamentally, like you're doing them a disservice if you're letting them focus on something that isn't you. If they're not focusing on you, they're not going to learn as much. So, you know, you need to make sure they're doing that.
Thank you. Someone's asking, how do you feel about live drawing versus a video of someone else drawing through it? I'm not sure I completely understand.
So can you just say that again?
How would you feel about live drawing versus a video of someone else drawing through it? So presumably, what you would explain, you would have an explanation taking place over a video of someone else drawing through something. I think it's probably from someone who's not very good at drawing.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, if you can hold fast to principles of redundancy, split attention, then I don't see the problem with it. Like, you know, if there's a magic hand on the board that is, you know, sometimes you see those videos online on YouTube, which is like an animation of a hand and it's drawing as it goes and stuff like that. If you can find one of those and blank out the audio and you pause it at various points or you talk over it, again, so long as you're holding away from, you know, the key thing here is split attention and redundancy. Whether you use a mini whiteboard or an actual board or a chalkboard or an exercise book or a video, whatever it is, so long as you've got their attention, you're not giving them anything redundant, and you're using diagrams that help make something complicated simple, then I personally think that it's what's the word, faithful to the theory.
Well, I think we're going to stop there. It's been super informative. Thank you very, very much, Adam. There's lots of other questions, so we'll send you a list of the questions should you have a minute today to perhaps answer some of them on Twitter.
Brilliant.
But no, that was really, really interesting. So thank you very much. And for anyone listening, we'll do our best to upload this video by the end of the day on our YouTube channel. Thank you, Adam, and have a good day.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Bye.